Okay, let's start. We have here Aurélio and Rodrigo from UFSJ with the presentation, "There is no such thing as a zombie world."
Hi, thank you very much for coming. We were worried about this title. It seems very pretentious for philosophical ears, but actually we found it funny because non-philosophers would think that it's quite plausible. Actually, they would think it's quite silly to make a presentation with such a title. So the thing is, we'll try to explore some thoughts on the zombie world more especially. We'll try to consider two objections to the notion of the zombie world, which was initially proposed and defended by Dave Chalmers in his first book, In the Conscious Mind. Well, the talk will be divided in two parts. It's a joint talk. I'll do the first part, and Marco Aurélio will assume in the last half. And well, in my case, I'll try to first make some considerations about our world in the way David Chalmers characterizes it, and then offer some thoughts on the zombie world, and then I'll try to see how some views about the meaning of physical terms would bring some consequences to the notion of the zombie world. Well, concerning our world, the actual world, David says that, well, it may consist in a couple of truths from which all other truths would be scrutable. By this he means that there are some class of truths, a compact class, which involves, at least in the beginning of the book, physical truths, which are, of course, not only the microphysical truths, but also the macrophysical truths. Thus, these will be truths that are presented or considered from the perspective of a fundamental physics about the fundamental world, but also objects of middle size, things that we recognize in our daily lives, and maybe big objects such as planets. These are all considered and presented among the macroscopic truths that are included in this class, the class P. Okay, but our world would also include some other kinds of truths, such as phenomenal truths, which are characterized by this letter Q. Phenomenal truths have or seem like truths, such as there exists an entity with such and such a phenomenal properties at such and such a time. These are truths about experiences, so to say, conscious experiences. But, well, there is another class of truths which he considers. It will not be very important for my talk today, but I'll have to mention it. This is the set of indexical truths. And these are truths like I am here, and now is, or today is Tuesday, and things like that. Okay, the last truth that he presents that should be counted in the scrutability base is a that's all clause, by saying that all the truths that were mentioned before are the ones that we consider, that we will consider, no other truths will be added. This set of truths is PQTI. This is how he presents the minimal scrutability base at the beginning of the book. It's kind of a toy example. He will later discuss that, and I will actually talk about it afterwards. Okay, the zombie world would be different from our world in respect to phenomenal truths, as we should expect, because he describes it in the conscious mind as a world physically identically to ours, so P is the same, but in which there are no conscious experience at all. In such a world, everybody is a zombie. So the thing that we might expect here is that there are no phenomenal truths in the zombie world. This I take to be something that would be assumed from this kind of characterization. In the conscious mind, he presents what would be the only route for opposing the notion of the zombie world, which says that, well, if we ever characterize it, or if we would be able to show that it involves a contradiction, then we'll be opposing the zombie world, or the whole notion of the zombie world. Otherwise, we should consider any critic of other kind as not being good enough. So in a sense, what I'll try to do here is to try to follow the only route. I don't know if I'll succeed at the end, but this is something that I want to do. And so in order to do this, my plan would be that the possibility is to argue that the possibility of defining physical expressions by means of phenomenal expressions allows a description of the zombie world that includes phenomenal truths. And this is the kind of contradiction that I'm looking for here. And this happens because in Chalmers' latest book, in The Constructing the World, he presents a way of characterizing the meaning of physical terms by means of phenomenal terms and other terms. I'll try to make some comments or remarks about this way of characterizing physical terms, which has some consequence to the way he thinks about physical truths. In a certain moment, he will say that physical truths are scrutable from a base that does not include physical truths. At least, not the sentences that are specified with physical terms. Okay, I'll have to talk about a little on his notion of definitions, or the way he characterizes definitions in the latest book. There he says that definitions usually take this form. Well, this is certainly the case for the definitions of general terms. For all x is f, if and only if x is g. He then considers the definition of knowledge, the traditional definition of knowledge, which says that knowledge is justified through belief. By putting it in a formula, it would look like this. And he says, of course, we have been presented with many cases, Gettier cases, which show that this definition is false. In a sense, the counterexamples that the Gettier cases present falsify the biconditional offered by the traditional definition. But one thing that he argues there, and one thing that we may all consider, is that even though the biconditional is false, or even though we may abandon this definition of knowledge, we may still have some a priori knowledge on the notion of knowledge. We may say that it's still the case that for all x, if x is knowledge, then x is justified through belief. We'll still have this material condition available as an a priori truth. Okay. In Constructing the World and many other places, he argues that, well, we may not have definitions, but there are certainly concepts or intentions with an S that guide the way we use terms. And these intentions are characterized as functions, from scenarios to extensions. These are the kinds of things that we use when considering Gettier cases. We are presented with a scenario, and by means of the definitions that we have or that we know, we may be able to identify whether that case is a case of knowledge or not. We are guided by the definitions, by the knowledge. And in Constructing the World, he presents in different moments of the book a strong pessimism in regard to the attempt to get definitions or precise definitions for every term. There he argues that for some expressions, okay, it might be the case, we can capture the intentions of the expressions in the form of a definition. In other cases, however, we will merely be able to approximate an intention with an approximate definition. This notion of an approximate definition is, I think, very interesting, but something that I really don't know how to characterize. Well, definitions, as I said, or as he himself presents them, are thought as biconditionals. They are they have this form for all x is f if and only if x is g. And what I want to ask here, this is a minor point of this presentation, is what's the form of an approximate definition? Are they material conditions? In a sense, it seems that there should be some material conditions of this form for all x. If x is f, then x is g, because there's always the possibility of there being counterexamples that would falsify the biconditional. So this is this is the most we can get in respect to characterizations of such terms, the terms that refer to f. Okay. Because we do not have definitions for all expressions, Chalmers argues that we might or should give up the definition of scrutability thesis, which we find in Carnap's Aufbau. It's not by means of definitions that we will recognize the scrutability relations between truths. This was originally the idea behind definitional scrutability. So we are given a set of truths, and by means of definitions, we may find what are the other truths that are scrutable from that basic set of truths. In his view, we should try other alternatives, and the one that he likes the most, at least it seems by reading the book, is a priori scrutability, which says that, well, the kinds of things that we will use in order to recognize the scrutable, well, the truths that are scrutable from a base, is an a priori knowledge of a material condition, or material conditions of the form if C then S. This is quite different from the approximate definitions, for sure, but it's a material condition. In this case, C is a set of truths that are given to us, let's say a description of the world or some part of the world. And because we know the material condition a priori, we can get to S. S is scrutable from C. Okay. In a chapter close to the end of the book, the 7th chapter, he tries different ways of minimizing the base that I described at the beginning of the talk. We shouldn't consider PQTI anymore. We may find a base that is more synthetical or less I don't even know how to characterize it. It would be, yeah, a more synthetical base, a more compact base. And he does that in a certain moment by removing P from the minimal scrutability base. And it would be possible, in fact, he argues in favor of removing B by the claim that, well, maybe we could analyze physical terms by means of other terms. And this would have the consequence that physical truths in which the physical terms occur would be scrutable from other truths. This analyzability of physical terms is defended by means of some remarks on the Ramsification or Ramsey-Carnap-Lewis method. He says that we may apply, such as in the same way that Ramsey, Carnap, and Lewis use the Ramsification, we may apply this procedure in order to get rid of theoretical terms in general, and so we will get rid of the physical terms as well. The whole point is to, starting by having a postulate of a theory, this is the traditional characterization, we will take out the physical terms and leave only empty spaces, and to them we'll place variables and so on, quantify over them, and at the end we'll get a characterization of the theory that will not include the physical terms that we had before. There will only be O terms, and by this he means O terms, as Lewis suggested, or observational terms, as Ramsey and Carnap suggested. One definition that he gives, I mean David Chalmers in the book, is that of the expression electron. He defines it as the kind E such that objects, he defines electron as the kind E such that objects with E have negative charge, orbit around the nucleus, play such and such a role in bounding, and so on. So this is a characterization in which the word electron does not occur. We only find here, this is not the case that we only find O terms, but at the end we will go further in analyzing all the physical terms that appear here. At the end we will get a definition in which only O terms would appear. But in respect to the O terms, he also claims that they can be further analyzed. And the idea is to analyze O terms by means of definitions in which we will find phenomenal terms. And this itself would suggest that O truths or observational truths would be scrutable from a base in which only phenomenal truths would occur. In fact, by claiming the analyzability by means of the Ramsey method of physical terms and the scrutability of physical truths, Chalmers doesn't say that we only need phenomenal truths. Phenomenal truths would certainly be there at the base, as well as indexable truths. And he argues that, well, we might have to use other truths as well, such as nomic truths, the truths in which nomic terms occur, such as it's a law that, and so on. Maybe also terms or truths about space and time, and these kinds of things. But for my presentation here, actually for the kind of objection that I want to present, it's not very important. At least I hope that it will not be very important. Which are the other truths involved in this base, in the scrutability base? It's important for me that we will get definitions of the physical terms in phenomenal terms plus the other terms, whatever they are, that will be needed. And this, as I said, is a justification for claiming the scrutability of P over the base QTI plus. Plus includes these other kinds of truths that I'm not talking about here. Okay. But as I said, Chalmers presents a kind of skeptical view or pessimistic view about definitions. And this occurs not only in respect to knowledge, it also appears in his text on physical terms. He says that there might always be counterexamples to our attempts to define words such as electron. So at the end, we may only have approximate definitions for these terms. Okay, this is a slide. This is actually very similar to a slide that I presented before. Here, I try to remind you that it's not clear what he means by approximate definitions. Definitions are clearly characterized as by conditions, but what are approximate definitions and how should we present their form? Should they be material conditions? Or could we, as an example, present an approximate definition of electron which is obtained by means of the Ramsey-Carnap-Lewis method, which would be something like that. For all x, if x is an electron, then x has negative charge, orbit around the nucleus, plays such and such a role in bounding and so on. Would this be an approximate definition of electron? Well, let's leave this aside for a moment and consider definitional scrutability and how it should work. I'll try to argue later that maybe approximate definitions will not do the job as he expects. Well, in respect to definitional scrutability, we might use definitions such as for all x is bachelor if and only if x is unmarried man to justify the scrutability of bachelor truths, which are sentences that use the word bachelor, such as there is a bachelor or he's a bachelor, from unmarried man truths, such as he's an unmarried man and so on. It works quite well if we use definitions. And so it would be in respect to electrons. For all x is an electron if and only if x is G, in which G is a kind of a phenomenal property that could be either a conjunction or of other phenomenal properties, or even a disjunction. It doesn't matter. The point is that by making a conjunction or a disjunction, G would still be a phenomenal property at the end. The point here is, by using this kind of definition, we would be able to go from there is an electron to there is an entity that instantiates G. Okay. Well, I think that the whole talk about the scrutability of physical truths from a minimal base in which physical truths do not occur suggests, and this is a welcome consequence of his view, that a duplicate of our world that would include Q, T, I, as they occur in our world, plus the other truths that I didn't mention, would also be a physical duplicate of the world. We apply the definitions as they were given to us, and we might say that, well, all truths about our world are scrutable in this duplicate of the world that only includes, or that's only characterized, actually. It includes physical truths, but it's initially characterized by means of QTI plus. Okay. As I said, this has worked really well with definitions, but in respect to approximate definitions, it might not work. At least if we think of approximate definitions in the way that I presented here. Maybe this is the point in which I made a mistake, but then this is how I interpreted the text. If we get approximate definitions of electrons in phenomenal terms, such as these, for all x, if x is electron, then x is G, then the occurrence of G would be not enough for the scrutability of electron truths, since there can always be counterexamples. If we assume the pessimistic view, and if we deny biconditionals that are offered by means of definitions of physical terms, then we might not be able to go from characterizations of the world in terms of the property, the phenomenal property G, or characterizations of the world in terms of Q, which is the whole set of phenomenal truths, to the scrutability of electron truths. Okay? Well, what should we say about the zombie world? And this is the last part of the talk, or at least my part, my session. Okay, sorry. Okay, the zombie world, as I said in the beginning, is characterized as a physical identical world. Well, it's physically identical to ours, to our world, and there are no conscious experience at all. And I argue that for this reason we shouldn't accept phenomenal truths in the zombie world, because no one has phenomenal experience there. But we could apply the Ramsey definitions to describe the zombie world, since, well, Ramsey definitions are simply the kinds of things that we get by the analysis of the physical terms. And as I said, these are definitions that present the meaning of physical terms without using these physical terms anymore, but just using phenomenal terms and other kinds of terms. The thing is, a definition of electron in phenomenal terms could be considered as for all x is an electron if and only if x is G. The fact is, here approximate definitions would also do the job if we consider them as things like for all x, if x is an electron, then x is G. The point is, at the end, we might be able to find G truths, or truths about the occurrence of phenomenal properties in the zombie world. So in this sense, even though it will be dark inside of our zombie twins, the truths that constitute the world, the zombie world, would still be describable, or in a sense, they could still be characterized as phenomenal truths. So this is the problem at the end. The idea is that the zombie world is characterized as having no conscious experience at all. This is the way he presents it in conscious mind. But it has plenty of phenomenal truths, because, well, we can apply the Ramsey definitions there, as we have applied in our world in order to take out the physical truths from the minimal base. So this is the first part of the talk, and now Marco Aurélio will continue.
All right. Actually, we are going to take very different routes, and we somehow very different topics, but we both come to the conclusion that there is something wrong with the idea of a zombie world, that for some reason he presented the reasons. Some reasons, I'm going to go through some others. Maybe zombie worlds are just not possible. Right? So in his popular texts in many places, Chalmers, he goes like number of popular arguments for dualism start from premise about an epistemic gap between physical truths, about consciousness, and infer an ontological gap between physical processes and consciousness. Arguments of this sort include the conceivability argument. Such arguments are often resisted on the grounds that epistemic premises do not entail ontological conclusions. So that's the typical argument against the conceivability argument, and it's exactly the one actually I'm going to try to explore a bit more. I do think, and actually that's what I'm going to argue here, that yeah, there is no way to go from epistemic premises to the metaphysical ones that involve, for instance, the metaphysical possibility of a zombie world. So my view here is, that's Chalmers again, is that one can legitimately infer ontological conclusions from epistemic premises if one is careful about how one reasons to do so. The best way is to reason first from epistemic premises to model conclusions about necessity and possibility, and then to ontological conclusions. Here, the crucial issue is the link, right, between the epistemic and the model. And yeah, I think that's where the trick lies. And my plan is to show what is the problem with this trick. So yes, like a typical type B materialist, I think that there is an epistemic gap, so I grant that. Still, I believe there is no ontological gap. So how can I say that? Now I'm going to reconstruct Chalmers' conceivability argument, press the points at which we diverge, and if I'm right, zombies are conceivable, but not metaphysically possible. And the possibility of zombie worlds is going to turn out to be this metaphysically loaded claim that cannot be derived from epistemic claims, no matter how nicely contrived your theory of modality is going to be. The conceivability argument basically says that, take P, conjunction of all physical truths, take Q as any arbitrary phenomenal truth. So if P and not Q, so all the truths of physics and some phenomenal, and if you take any phenomenal truth, it's actually going to turn out false in this world, so there's no phenomenal truths in there. If that's conceivable, so P and not Q, it's going to be metaphysically possible. If metaphysically possible, materialism is false, materialism is false. P and not Q is basically the zombie world, right? So, well, the first premise, P and not Q is conceivable. Says, that's David again. To a first approximation, you can say that sentence S is conceivable when S expresses a coherent hypothesis, one that cannot be ruled out a priori. Granted that if P not Q is not knowable a priori, it follows that P and not Q is at least a coherent hypothesis, and since I accept that P and not Q is conceivable, I'm committed to accepting this. I mean, yeah, you can know if P then Q on a priori basis. That's definitely a coherent hypothesis. But we can say that S is, he makes this distinction between being prima facie and ideally conceivable. The idea is, it's not just I'm not thinking hard enough, I'm not that clever, I've just missed some things. No, let's take the ideal conceiver, so whatever is possible, does not involve a contradiction, whatever is a coherent hypothesis, I'm capable of conceiving. So I'm going to be talking from now on only about this ideal conceiver. So, and premise two. So premise one is fine for me. Premise two, if the zombie world is ideally conceivable, is it metaphysically? It is metaphysically possible. So that's the step from the epistemic to the metaphysical. Well, I grant that a zombie world is ideally conceivable. The thing here is the step, or the move from conceivability to possibility. Well, conceivability is typically used to link the epistemic and the model. There is an obvious sense in which conceivability, some sort of model imagination, somehow reveals logical epistemics and all sorts of possibilities. But still, metaphysical possibility may need something more. Chalmers claims that if we get the appropriate model theory, the right, some finer model semantics to make some finer distinctions, he can bridge this epistemic metaphysical gap. Well, let's take a look at his model semantics. Well, it's standard semantics, so that's the Kripken one. Attributes extension, intention to expressions. So the extension of a singular term is going to be an individual. Of a predicate set of individuals, the intention is going to be dysfunction from possible worlds to extension. So the intention of a singular term, for instance, maps possible worlds to the reference. So if we take just extension of a singular term, it's going to be an individual, and its intension a function from worlds to individual. Standard model semantics is centered in the actual world. I mean, the reference is fixed here in this world, the actual one. Being the other worlds evaluated from this privilege point of view. And on this view, a necessary a posteriori truth is a fact about the actual world that limits the set of possible worlds. So if you say that water is H2O, you're saying that the intention of both terms, water and H2O, are the same. They refer rigidly to the same extension at all possible worlds. So that's standard model semantics. So, and here are two quotes from Chalmers. According to Kripke, there are many statements that are knowable only empirically, but that are true in all possible worlds. For example, the empirical discovery that Hesperus is phosphorus, but there is no possible world in which Hesperus is not phosphorus, as both, Hesperus and phosphorus are identical to Venus in all possible worlds. So if so, Hesperus and phosphorus, those two expressions, have the same intention that picks out planet Venus in all possible worlds. Even though the two terms are cognitively distinct, if this is correct, the intentions are strongly dissociated from cognitive significance, and I think he's right. I mean, there is something about this model semantics that the intention attributed to the terms, they're not anymore capturing cognitive significance. So still, there is a strong intuition that the members of this pair, Hesperus phosphorus or water and H2O, he gives this other example, in David Chalmers, when he says I, of course, differ in some aspect of meaning. Further, there is a strong intuition that there is some way the world could turn out so that these terms will refer to different things. So it's natural to continue use an analysis in terms of possibility and necessity to capture aspects of these cognitive differences. So the idea is we have some more work to do in model semantics in order to capture this distinction. Standard semantics is just not capable, does not offer enough resources to capture this aspect of meaning, right? Well, as things turn out, that's, Chalmers again, water, H2O, have the same extension here, but there are ways things could have turned out so that the two terms could have had different extensions and different Kripken intentions. So there is a sense, and this is the important passage here, in which a term like water, the term's extension and its Kripken intention depend on the character of the world. So given that this world is actual, it turns out that water is H2O. And its Kripken intention picks out H2O in all possible worlds. However, if another world had been actual, water might have referred to something quite different, you know, X, Y, Z, and it might have had an entirely different Kripken intention, one that picks out X, Y, Z in all possible worlds. So he came out with this theory. I just kind of go through quickly here, two-dimensionalism, which is basically his way of accommodating the semantic tuitions that find no room in standard modal semantics. So roughly speaking, it's gonna now associate, two-dimensionalism associates two different intentions, two different extensions, to the expressions. The first, and he calls it one intention, or primary intention, and extension, and secondary intention, secondary extension. So what is the one intention or primary one? The extension of an expression in a world considered as actual. One intention is going to be this function mapping center worlds considered as actual to one extension. Two extension and two intention are just like the standard ones I just talked about. So the core idea here in two-dimensional semantics is that there are two different ways in which the expression, the extension of an expression depends on possible states of the world, corresponding to these two sorts of dependence. And these two intentions correspond to different ways of thinking of possibilities. In the first case, one thinks of a possibility as representing a way the actual world might turn out to be, which is to consider a possibility as actual. The other one is just kind of considering the actual world is fixed. You think how it might have been, so you're going to consider possibility as counterfactual. Well, so that's just kind of getting all the cards on the table. So let's see what we get out of this. Chalmers characterizes his two-dimensional theory. I mean, there are many on the market. He says that he is this epistemic kind of two-dimensionalist, in which this first dimension, so intention one and extension one, are going to be understood as epistemic possibilities. And here he has two key ideas. The first one is the idea of an epistemic space, which is the ways the world might turn out to be, and this other idea of scrutability. So, which is the idea that if we know how the world has turned out, or once we know which epistemic possibility is actual, so as soon as you get in your epistemic space one possibility, epistemic possibility, and once you know which one you take as, consider as actual, you are in a position to determine the extensions of your expression. So together, these two ideas, so, let me skip. So about the epistemic space, which is the first key idea here. It's going to include all epistemically possible hypotheses, anything that cannot be ruled out a priori. So oceans might contain XYZ instead of H2O. I could be someone else, not Marco, all those possibilities. Since they do not involve direct contradictions, they're going to be fine. Okay, I'm going to skip to this second one here. Some possibilities in the space. Actually, the only thing I want to take from this slide here is the idea that those epistemically possible hypotheses, if we understand them as maximally as maximal possibilities, so including all possibilities combined to it, it's pretty much like a possible world in the metaphysical classical sense is a maximal metaphysical possibility. If you take this epistemic space to determine epistemically maximal possibilities, we're going to call it now a scenario, which is pretty much an epistemically possible world. Right, so a scenario corresponds to a maximally specific way a world might be for all you can know a priori. Right, so take scrutability, which is the second key idea here. The idea is that there is a strong epistemic dependence of an expression's extension on the state of the world. So if we come to know that the world has a certain character, we are in a position to conclude that the expression has a certain extension. And if we were to learn that the world has a different character, you will be in a position again to conclude that the expression has a different extension. That is, we are in a position to come to know the extension of expression depending on which epistemic possibility turns out to be actual. So pretty much, you imagine maximal epistemic hypothesis, you imagine or conceive a scenario. If you know that scenario, you can consider it as actual. Once you know the scenario, consider it as actual, you can take the extensions here. Scrutability demands a scenario that exhibits a complete state of the world. Otherwise, the extension may be underdetermined. But, and I mean, now it's time to move from what Chalmers said to what I find particularly problematic in this whole control. But how can the mere conception of a coherent hypothesis allow the individuation, for instance, of particulars, or the full construction of a world? So how can we understand this scenario, the maximal epistemic possibility, that it is actually a full description, not under-described in any relevant sense. So without particulars to serve as the reference for our singular terms, intensions are going to lack extension. So the idea is, if I say that that thing in the oceans, rivers, blah, blah, is water, I'm pointing to something and saying that that's water and that thing is H2O. As I do that, I pick out this very object and make reference to some particular, in this case, natural kind, but I can just talk about Rodrigo, or I just can pick out any particular in this world. If I think of a possible scenario that is just a priori conceivable, so it involves no, it has nothing that can be ruled out a priori, so it's only a maximally consistent hypothesis. When I have this description, I don't have the particulars, I just have this kind of layout without the particulars. So as soon as I get this image in front of me, I do not actually pick out the relevant thing. So if I just take the intention, I change the whole world, and I keep this pointing to the world. But now you change, I am in a scenario, I don't know exactly what is there. I don't really get the extension, so I'm going to try to make this idea clearer. One extension is something of a mystery to me. So the extension in this first dimension, which is the epistemical one. Unless an actual individual is picked out, we are left with this structural, functional blueprint that cannot be filled with content, pointing to something in particular, getting something in particular, are two very distinct things. So one is to refer to something. The other thing is to pick out a reference, so you can fail. You can be a referential failure, right? Pointing to something, blah, blah. A scenario looks awkwardly like a bunch of functions that get no values, being something short of a world. So Chalmers uses this term verifies, saying that a world W verifies sentence S if S is the case, when W is considered as actual. So suppose, for instance, the hypothesis that Santa Claus exists. So it's conceivable. There is a scenario in which the sentence S star, Santa Claus is coming to town, is verified. What exactly is the one intention of S star? What is the one extension of the term Santa Claus in this sentence? Compare that with the claim that XYZ may be the one extension of water at some possible worlds. Well, what can make this sentence the case in the relevant scenario? And how can we evaluate this sentence, Santa is coming to town, in any other world when this possible scenario was considered as actual? It's pretty much the whole idea of the model semantics, the classical one. If I point here and say this is Rodrigo, and then I'm going to consider some possible worlds, some truths containing Rodrigo in the sentence, I just have to get Rodrigo in this world, and then I go check if it's the case that Rodrigo is there. I'm pointing to him. I say Rodrigo is a nice guy. If Rodrigo is there in this world and he's still a nice guy, that's true, right? But this verification relation here, since we are not taking the actual world in the basis, it's not fixed in the actual world. It's fixed in some possible scenario. The possible scenario may give you a lot of descriptions, but not particulars. So I don't really know what to get in order to evaluate the truth of sentences when I consider other worlds from this new center, which is where it's going to be fixed, the reference. So the possibilities evaluated in the second dimension, this is Chalmers again, are usually thought of as possible worlds. Sure, the second dimension, classic one. Possibilities evaluated in the first one, the first dimension, the epistemic one, are a little different as they reflect the nature of a world from the point of view of a speaker using an expression within a world. It is useful for many purposes to see these possibilities as center worlds, worlds marked with the center, which is another pair of an individual and a time. So I think that there's conflation, or, you know, I'm going to hurry. This conflation of the scenario and center world is spurious. A scenario is less than a world in a very important sense. A scenario is a maximal epistemic possibility that admits anything that cannot be ruled out a priori, but the particulars that inhabit a world, serve as reference for singular terms, are not graspable a priori. The particulars that actually exist limit the space of metaphysical possible worlds in a way that possible scenarios are not limited. So when scenarios are simply equated with center worlds, they surreptitiously acquire the status of possible worlds. Given the stuff the actual world's made of, some scenarios may turn out to be metaphysically impossible. After all, what gives a priori reasoning? Even ideally conceived, the capacity to construct worlds that are not only consistent, or maximally consistent hypothesis, but also metaphysically possible. Why is it something that an a priori conceiver can get to, right? We could, if we want, for instance, if we want to model our epistemic assessment of possibilities or cognitive abilities, or, as he said, the cognitive differences that standard model semantics is not capable of grasping, we could appeal, for instance, to impossible worlds. We could model them somehow. A lot of people actually do that. If you want to explain some sort of epistemic ability to conceive things, if you want to model our assessment of possibilities, you don't need to, from this, conclude the metaphysical possibility. You can use impossible worlds to model. It's pretty much you are in a position that a priori you cannot rule out these possibilities, so you're going to take them as possible, but only in this weak sense. But being metaphysically possible is way more than just being conceivable, but it depends on what this world is actually made of, the actual world. And this limits the space of possibilities in a way that mere conceivability is never going to get. So I'm going to skip this. Well, Well, David Chalmers, in many passages, he defends that this verification, when you verify if some sentence is true in some epistemic possible world, is broadly an epistemic relation tied to a certain rational process. Verification of statement by an imagined situation is broadly analogous to some sort of entailment of one statement by another. So you can say that a world W verifies S is roughly to imagine a situation that leads to the truth of S. There must be some sort of canonical description of this world. And from this canonical description, it follows S. So a canonical description is a complete description of a world in a semantically neutral vocabulary plus, some lexicals. The idea is that only non-twin earthable terms could be in this basic vocabulary, and that's what he means by being semantically neutral. And if you give a description of a world in such terms, it's going to follow the sentences that are verified in this world. Well, this crucial question here is whether a canonical description amounts to an ontologically complete description of a world. So the description must be able to specify all truths of the described world without appealing to any twin earthable term. Well, and I mean, once again, I just can't see how this can be done. A world described with non-twin earthable terms cannot determine its inhabitants. The world is simply underdescribed. How can the truth of senses like Marco is drinking water, the painting has a unique shade of red, I mean, any reference to particulars, you cannot later derive it from the canonical description. So, I'm going to skip this because of time pressure, because I can make the point here. The whole thing here is the metaphysical non-sector. Two-dimensionalism was supposed to offer a model semantics capable of bridging the epistemic metaphysical gap, which will vindicate the second premise of the conceivability argument, which is if you can conceive the zombie world, it's metaphysically possible. But in order to have this job done, one intentions must be understood as functions over metaphysically possible worlds. It does the trick by equating metaphysically scenarios with the centered worlds, but I don't see how a scenario can be a full world or completely described. So actually, the canonical description never gets under-describes the world. So a lot of truths cannot be verified. So Chalmers claims that scenarios and metaphysically possible worlds correspond to two distinct ways of evaluating sentences in relation to the same set of worlds. So if you have the set W of worlds, and if this world is considered a world in this set is considered as actual, it is going to be said to be epistemically possible. If it is considered as counterfactual, it's going to be metaphysically possible. Well, what I'm trying to say here is that the thing that's said to be epistemically possible is not in the same set, because it's not a world, it's something less than a world. So in order to draw metaphysical conclusions from the epistemic capacity, to conceive, he needs to go from one conceivability to two possibility. And this is exactly the step that seems illegitimate. If a scenario is not a centered world, since it's not a complete ontological description, whatever is being conceived is not yet, per se, metaphysical possible situation. So to finish here, if we go back to the zombie argument and just get all these steps now using the two-dimensional vocabulary, now the whole idea is if the zombie world is conceivable, it is one possible. If it's one possible, it's two possible, because it's just actually taking the same set of worlds, consider one as actual or as counterfactual. If it is two possible, materialism is going to be false. Conclusion, materialism is false. So my whole point here is to challenge this third premise, blocking it. The metaphysical conclusion is not going to follow. In other words, even if one can conceive a zombie world. It doesn't follow from that it's going to be metaphysically possible. I'm going to skip this whole part, which has to do with the physical vocabulary and the canonical description. And just to conclude, well, I guess there are more, just one thing here. Chalmers criticizes, for instance, the materialists when they say that they argue against the possibility of zombie worlds and defend that if P, then Q, if you have from the truths, the physical truths, it's going to follow the phenomenal ones. As being a necessary a posteriori truth, so this Chalmers sees in this claim an important disanalogy. He believes that in cases like water is H2O, the classical example, the truths, if you know the relevant facts about water and H2O, you can deduce that they're the same, so the truths of one are going to actually imply truths about the second one. In the physical phenomenal case, however, there is a unique explanatory gap, so when, it's not deducible from other truths, and you cannot actually, if you understand P, understand Q, you don't really get it. This necessitation relation or identity relation depends on the kind of materialist you are. Well, according to Chalmers, so this is going to be a brute fact. It does not qualify as an explanation or a reduction, and so the consciousness, the hard problem is just going to stand. Well, and he says here, we might call this argument the magic bullet, which one can use to kill all our explanatory problems by drawing disparate phenomena together. Yeah, I kind of agree. The magic bullet here is certainly not itself an explanation of anything, but its postulation may prove itself fruitful, justifiable within a long inference to the best explanation. Its uniqueness may even be plausible given, explanatory gap and what makes it the case. It may be something about the kind of access we have to evidences in these different domains. So if our typical epistemic routes fail us, we might adopt some atypical procedures. In that case, we might have to look at the bigger picture in order to settle the matter. So here is a passage in which Chalmers, at the end of a long series of arguments, he says that, well, maybe Russellian monism is right, or maybe interactionism, or maybe epiphenomenalism. So you have three options left. And it says that, well, depending on the day of the week, is gonna, his loyalties are gonna go to one of those views. At the end of the day, the choice will come to which of the disjuncts yields the most successful detailed theory in the light of a well-developed science of consciousness. So here is the thing. I believe that I try to block an a priori argument, and maybe I'm going to postulate this classical type B materialist clause that, P necessitates Q. But when I do that, I'm not just kind of using a magic bullet that I think is going to solve all the problems. And it's just a start. It's the first step towards long inference to the best explanation. So I guess there are more open questions than Chalmers is willing to accept. So, and the choice among these options is going to merge from this long inference to the best explanation. The possibility of zombie worlds, or so I try to argue here, is not something we should expect to be derived from sophisticated a priori reasoning. Even an ideal conceiver is not supposed to extract metaphysical truths from merely consistent hypotheses. This is so because this set of ways our world might have been is constrained by how it actually is. So in order to get the relevant set of worlds, one needs to know all the fundamental facts of our world, all the intrinsic natures, everything. And a priori reasoning won't give you that, no matter how fine, how ideal. At the end of the day, the possibility of a zombie world is not a step towards a knockdown argument in metaphysics, but the upshot of a complete metaphysics, all things considered. So I think it's just kind of, if you take the zombie world, the zombie possibility as not being derived from epistemic conceivability. It's left as an open option, and the only way to decide is going to be, at the end of the whole story, the metaphysical story, all things considered. What we have to explain, what's the best explanation, maybe a good, the materialist necessitation, is going to be a reasonable hypothesis. So that's it. Thank you.
Okay, any questions?
So I just have a simple question for Rodrigo, because I didn't exactly understand what was going on. The question is whether I'm working. So is your idea that a phenomenal duplicate will also be a physical duplicate?
Yeah, this was claimed.
So that's very puzzling. I mean, because of course there was a time in the history of our universe, most people believe, where there were no non-necessary phenomenal truths true at all. But there were physical truths that were true. And that looks like a refutation of that claim, unless you think that there are phenomenal truths that occur later that make the earlier physical truths true.
Okay, actually the thing was, if we grant Chalmers the idea that we may define physical terms by means of phenomenal terms, and if this definition is something like, well, a physical property, let's say F, occurs if and only if a certain phenomenal property G occurs. This is the kind of thing that we get by the ramification of physical terms by means of phenomenal terms and other terms. Then, yeah, at the end we would have to say that the occurrence of these physical properties would imply that there are phenomenal properties occurring there. And actually my point was not to argue in favor of this view and claim that the zombie world, or even our world before people appeared or animals appeared, would be full of phenomenal truths. Actually, what I'm trying to present is that, well, this idea is kind of strange, and however, it seems to be a consequence of the ramification of physical terms by means of the old terms, which are themselves analyzed by means of phenomenal terms, or some phenomenal terms.
That seems enough to refute.
Yeah.
To refute that claim.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You're right.
Oh, well, thank you both for the very interesting discussion. I think that between you, you've attempted to conclusively refute the zombie argument by refuting both premises. First, Rodrigo attempted to refute the premise that zombie worlds are conceivable, I think, and Marco attempted to refute the premise that if they are conceivable, they're possible. So if you're both right, I'm really in trouble. Maybe I'll start with Rodrigo, since he was first. I mean, I think that actually much of what you say is correct. Given certain things I say about the semantics of physical terms, you can make a surprisingly good case that zombie worlds are inconceivable, ruled out a priori. One way to think about this is just to take an example, like take a physical term like mass, and go with the kind of structuralist semantics for mass, where mass is whatever plays the mass role. Sometimes that's done when the mass role is just something within the physical situation that contained mass, but that didn't contain mass's experience. And of course, zombie world is supposed to be one such situation. Zombie worlds are ruled out a priori. I'm actually now inclined to think that's not a bad argument, and it does reveal a tension in my views. Untitled Soldier has done some recent work trying to bring this out. I don't know how much of it has been published so far, but he has a paper in progress called Charmers versus Charmers, where he says something, this functionalism about physical is in tension with the conceivability of zombie worlds. There's a couple of things I can say. One thing is to try and resist the claim by noting, well, the role required for terms like mass or whatever is not just a phenomenal role. It's a cluster role involving connections to various physical things as well as connections to experience. And it might be that something could count as playing the mass role if it plays enough of the role. It might be, for example, some physical part of the role without playing the experiential part of the role. If it went like that, then maybe zombie world would end up conceivable after all because something plays enough of the role in the zombie world. So even though the a priori semantics for mass involves something phenomenal, maybe the conditions for there being mass could be satisfied without there being anything phenomenal. So that's one kind of strategy I could take. I guess the other kind of strategy is to say, yeah, okay, strictly speaking, zombie worlds are inconceivable, but I never needed them for the purposes of the argument anyway, that would be a little bit embarrassing. Since in my conscious mind I put quite a lot of stress on zombie worlds, but one very natural way to do it would be to say, okay, well, this argument may rule out zombie worlds, but it certainly doesn't rule out partial zombie worlds. For example, a world where everyone else but me is a zombie. I mean, the role the experience plays here seems to be really mostly in the first-person case. Maybe my own experiences play a very central role in fixing reference to what I call mass. It'll be consistent with that everybody else is a zombie, and indeed there'll be bits of the early universe with physics and no consciousness, and assuming conceivability entails possibility and so on, we'll get the possibility of partial zombie worlds, and that's plausibly enough to say all the facts about consciousness are not entailed by the physical facts, and it would still be enough to make the argument go through. Another strategy is to reconceive the relevant premise instead of as one about the zombie world being physically identical to our world without consciousness, conceive it as one which is structurally identical to our world without consciousness. And I think that you can make that case in terms of structural roles without any of these issues coming through, and then try to make the case that suffices to make the argument against physicalism, because it's conceivable you have all that structure without consciousness, so it's possible you have all that structure without consciousness, and then make a connection from that to that possibility entailing a world that's physically identical without consciousness. Torun Alter has actually spelled out a version of that strategy in a reply to Stoljar recently. So, okay, so this is to say I think the points you've made are very good ones and somewhat embarrassing ones to me, but I'd like to think at least they can be answered without changing the things which are essentially required for my argument.
Thank you for your remarks. I think I agree these are three good ways of dealing with the problem, actually.
Maybe the next talk's going to be, the title is going to be, there are no such things as partial zombie worlds, but this one is.
Very good. Happy to say something also about Marco, although I don't want to completely hog the floor. Okay, so yeah, Marco, you made many different points, and I'd have to really go through them one at a time. I mean, the general flavor was to say that epistemic possibilities and metaphysical possibilities are different kinds of things. I mean, you put this by saying epistemic possibilities are not worlds, but metaphysical possibilities are. But I would resist that way of putting things. I think, the notion of world is not really a proprietary one. Maybe it's closely associated with metaphysical possibility in philosophy, but I think, you can have world-like entities associated with almost any modality, including the metaphysically possible and the epistemically possible. And I don't see why we should privilege the metaphysical possibilities as worlds, but I take it the general point is that, the fundamental entities associated with each of those modalities are distinct. And that's I think that's a point I'm prepared to concede. I think the paper of mine that discusses the issues you discussed the most is one called The Nature of Epistemic Space, where I really try to go through the construction of epistemic possibilities and epistemically possible worlds in the most care, and connect it to metaphysical possibilities. I mean, there was a few things you said. One is that the epistemically possible worlds don't have individuals built in. Well, I think they do and they don't, precisely to the extent that metaphysically possible worlds do and don't. I mean, if you're David Lewis, of course metaphysically possible worlds have individuals built in, because they're just, they're just like this world. But otherwise, if you're not David Lewis, then these worlds are things you have to construct. And, there are different kinds of constructions, some that start from sentences, some that go beyond them to build in individuals. I think there are constructions that yield individuals for the metaphysically possible. There are also constructions that do that for the epistemically possible scenarios, and that's one thing I try to do in the paper on epistemic space. It's true there are simpler constructions that are purely sentential and don't do that, but I think the same goes in the case of metaphysically possible world. I think there are constructions in both cases. The question then is going to be the relation between those constructions. I mean, there are certainly respects in which they come apart. One obvious respect is that epistemically possible worlds seem to be somehow indexical sensitive, sensitive to things like the behavior of I and here and now, where it's less obvious that metaphysically possible worlds have that. So that's why I say that epistemically possible worlds are centered worlds. Whether or not they're centered metaphysically possible world, they're at least seem to be sensitive to a center of a kind. But that's at least, but that difference, I think, doesn't do anything to stop the arguments from going through. Indeed, you mentioned the possibility of I don't know if you mentioned the possibility of a bit. You mentioned a couple of things about fixates. Anyway, the thesis that's important to me, once you separate the objects of these things, the thesis which is important to me is not that there's a one-to-one correspondence between epistemically possible scenarios, let's say, and metaphysically possible worlds. Rather, it's the thesis I call metaphysical plenitude, that for every epistemically possible scenario, there is a corresponding, at least one corresponding metaphysically possible world that, at least for every epistemically possible claim, there's a corresponding centered metaphysically possible world that verifies that claim. I'm not sure you actually gave any arguments against that claim, the plenitude claim, which is the most important one for me. You did point to various interesting ways in which the phenomena can come apart. I'd have to go through all the slides one at a time. One of the things you mentioned was that epistemic possibilities don't really narrow down the nature of the individuals. I mean, it's true there are certain philosophical views on which the nature of I think it is plausible that the characterization of epistemically possible worlds will be, in a certain sense, qualitative. It is true there are philosophical views on which qualitative characterizations don't fix with metaphysical necessity the character of the individuals in metaphysically possible worlds. That's, I guess, what some people call a modal hexaeist view, where different possible worlds can be qualitatively identical. I think those views are controversial. If you don't accept those views, then I don't think the gap you mentioned obviously arises. If you do accept those views, then that, I think, will entail that metaphysically possible worlds can be more fine-grained in a certain respect than epistemically possible worlds, which would be interesting if true, but I don't think does anything to refute the metaphysical plenitude thesis, which just requires there be enough metaphysically possible worlds to verify all the epistemically possible scenarios. On this view, there would be more than enough. There would be multiple metaphysical possibilities. You might also get other examples where there are multiple metaphysical possibilities if it turns out there are some properties that are inconceivable in a certain sense. And I think I discussed those under the heading of plenitude in the epistemics, under the heading of parsimony in the epistemic space paper. I don't think any of those, though, yet are counterexamples to metaphysical plenitude. So that's the central thesis to me. And I guess I'm interested in whether you have arguments here directly against the metaphysical plenitude thesis that suggests there's a metaphysical possibility in the vicinity of every epistemic possibility. I mean, it's another thing you could be trying to do is just, instead of giving a direct argument against it, just softening people up for the claim that it's false by showing that these modalities can come apart in interesting ways. And then I think we'd want to go through and really engage the case for plenitude carefully. But maybe you can clarify this point.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for your comments. The first thing you said about what a world is supposed to be, and it can mean different things. I mean, as you said before, I'm not going to dispute words. I mean, you can use it the way you like, right? Anyone can use it, and they do use it in various ways. I mean, if you take Lewis, for instance, definitely the Lewisian, how do you say that? World in Lewis theory is something completely different than the way I was using this word here. That's true. But it's still, the thing is that there are two different characterizations. One that it's going to have this metaphysically loaded sense, and the other one which is just going to be the epistemical possibility, right? So that's the relevant thing. You're right. You said a lot of things here. Maybe about this, sure, I mean, my criticism here, if I wanted to make it really to touch the nerve, I would need a complete theory of modality myself, which unfortunately I don't have to offer. So I pretty much, obviously I have my preferred views and so on, but I didn't make them explicit. So of course a lot of things I say, you can look around and see many ways of going around, you know, depending on how the details of your modality is going to be understood. But one of the things is, I mean, definitely I'm not going to deal with particulars in the sense of, you know, counterparts as Lewis. I think there are, you know, identity problems that are really embarrassing. You can't get rid of them. How you come to identify this, the particulars in the different worlds. But anyways, you said something here that I'm more interested. This corresponding kind of relation between scenarios and worlds. This correspondence, it's suppose whatever a scenario or epistemic possibility is, there is some world in the vicinity, right, the metaphysical kind of world in the vicinity. Well, but my point here is not that you cannot link those two things in various ways. It's just that whatever the epistemic possibility is, it under-describes a metaphysically possible world. So you can kind of have a lot of possible worlds that are nicely linked to this possibility, right? So it's pretty much they're compatible. Let's say that those worlds are the case if you consider this scenario, they correspond to, let's say. Still, I don't really have this scenario completely filled with the details in the way the world is, so it under-describes. And I think that this under-description is exactly where the zombies are going to appear as a possibility. And when
zombies are a possibility, that's very good for me.
Epistemic, yes, I grant that. The thing is, in order to make them a metaphysical possibilities, these details, I mean, the devil is going to be in the details exactly. So maybe depending on how the world is, it's just going to turn out to be impossible, and that's the very point of type B materialists. I think it's still left open. It's an open option. It's not ruled out by the conceivability argument. So that's the whole point, right? But I agree. I mean, I would need to go through the whole modality story to really make a compelling point here.
Okay, thanks. That's yeah, that's helpful. I mean, I guess it seems to me there's two very different ways in which the epistemically possible scenarios and the metaphysically possible worlds can fail to correspond. Very roughly, one is there being more metaphysically possible worlds than epistemically possible worlds, and the other one is there being fewer metaphysically possible worlds and epistemically possible worlds, at least in a respect. I mean, maybe there could be cases of both. What you mentioned, what you appealed to, and I think what you brought out in the talk is cases in one direction where you said now a characterization of an epistemically possible world might under-describe a metaphysically possible world. That sounds like it incompletely describes it. There will be multiple metaphysically possible worlds consistent with this epistemically possible world. So that sounds like one direction of coming apart where there are more than enough metaphysically possible worlds.
Sorry, no, you're right, I agree.
But of course what the type B materialist needs is the reverse, where the epistemically possible world actually over-describes metaphysically possible worlds. It describes it so tightly there are no metaphysically possible worlds that are consistent with it or that verify it. And I don't see yet that you've made the case for the two coming apart in that way.
That's a good point. Obviously, I was interested in this step from conceivability to possibility, right? The metaphysical one. So since this is the direction I was interested, there is something under-described or metaphysically under-described. But I agree that depending on the dimension you get, for instance, obviously the epistemic world is finer, for instance, to capture cognitive differences. So things that you can imagine, even though they are not metaphysically possible. So they are finer in another sense. But I didn't think about that, yeah. But I think that makes sense, but I will need to get these distinct dimensions clear.
I mean, there's a strong, I mean, I'm thinking of the relevant thesis as being from conceivability to possibility. Just say you wanted, I mean, there are views like the view I called strong modal rationalism that try to equate them in both directions. You know, possibility entails conceivability. They line up very strongly. And I think to articulate, if you want to articulate that very strong thesis, then I think you really do have to worry about these plenitude problems, that, you know, the metaphysical possibilities might appear to be fine-grained, more fine-grained in various respects. This could even happen with things very much in the vicinity of the mind-body problem, in my view. Just say you think there are possible realizers of physical dispositions that we can never conceive. You know, maybe one possible realizer is consciousness. Maybe we can conceive of that. But maybe there are other metaphysically possible realizers that are totally inscrutable and inconceivable. There are views where that could happen. If that turned out to be the case, then there might turn out to be metaphysical possibilities here that go beyond the epistemic possibilities. That, what I think, would cause serious problem for a possibility entails conceivability thesis, but maybe the conceivability to possibility thesis would still look okay.
I haven't thought of that. I mean, that's interesting, actually. I'm going to think about that. I don't have a ready, you know, top of my mind answer. Top of my head, no. Yeah, thank you.